Hi, this is Ben Kenny, logging back in, Son of Kenny Films. I hope you guys are doing well. Glad to see you again, and I appreciate you coming to watch my video once more. Please give a like, and if you like, subscribe. That is to say, if you like it, then subscribe. So the first step is like, and then the second is to subscribe. So today I want to talk to you all a little bit about writing that novel that you've been meaning to write for most or all of your life. Now, it may not be a novel, it may be a collection of poems or even a non-fiction work, but it generally equally applies. But for our purposes today, let's keep the word novel for purposes of ease and simplicity. Now, the thing that's really on my mind today is I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who is an artist by trade, that is to say, a painter. And he's lived around the world. He's originally from America, from the Midwest, and he's lived in China, Cambodia, many other places around this blue earth. And I actually met him when I used to work in China many years ago. So we kept in touch over the years, and we were just talking the other day a little bit about our respective crafts. So while he is a visual artist and works with paints and canvas for the most part in his spare time, although he has gotten a bit of recognition in recent days, I primarily work with words and paper. So I'm both a poet and also a novelist, and I've written essays and a number of other works that have been published here and there, to put it lightly. But it's a good thing. But what I'm trying to say, keeping humble here, is that while we have very different crafts in certain respects, I realized that when he asked me for a bit of advice, it probably would apply to some degree to both forms, that is to say, painting and literature. So what he was asking me, he asked me, Ben, what do you think about trying to create a new charisma for your brand? How is it that I can increase my brand in my own mind, really, and bring that to the people? But moreover, how is it that I can actually create content that is within the bounds of what I want to create and is not somehow hijacked by popular demand or what I dream it is or what others tell me it is, and create what is true to me and to my personality, and yet should still predictably have a good level of pan-demographic interest, or something that can create interest in a larger demographic. And my answers were manifold and many and pretty diverse. But what I realized after a certain point of us talking for the good part of an hour was that ultimately we were talking about something much more basic than trying to create content that will be interesting and for the, essentially sellable to the wider world, to a customer base. And that's something that we can talk about in a later video, because I think I did lead into it, but ultimately it's a second tier issue. The first tier issue, the ground floor issue, is about how to write that novel in the first place. And it does tie in, though, which is why I led into it, marketability. So the first thing is, when you're trying to write a novel or any other sort of book, you have to be able to discipline yourself to get the work done in the first place. People have this dream of writing their first novel or their 10th novel before they've written one at all. And the main axiom to live by with regard to this is the only way to start is to start. And as cliche or almost silly and repetitive as that sounds, it's truer than any other maxim or axiom for this particular type of consideration that I have found, or that I have sort of said myself. I'm sure it's come from somewhere else, but that's what came to mind when I was speaking with my friend. So I wanted to share with you a few tips about how to go forward with writing this novel. So here's an example. This is my first book, Hamahberet Seura, or The Moonlit Notebook, which is actually a collection of poems. So this first book was one that, to be honest with you, took many years to compose and compile, and then possibly even longer to edit, because there are a number of languages represented in the book, and some of those languages in their written form are significantly more complicated than English, for example, in terms of editing. So you have a multiplicity of dots and diacritics that go around those letters, and to edit those by oneself, it's a many-person job, and it takes a level of expertise, which in my case I was learning as I went along, and I think it came out quite well at the end. But I basically got a degree in linguistics through undertaking this project on my own. And primarily why I did it that way was honestly because I thought, well, who else can I possibly trust with such a, truly delicate task? Obviously you do have people to hire, you have editors that you can hire, but when you have something as delicate as poetry, your own poems that are written in the sort of language which requires a lot of detail to the dots and diacritics and all the special markings, which you may feel are very important to the meaning itself, then it becomes a bit problematic even to entrust that task to the so-called experts. In my experience, you frequently have to become an expert yourself in that field in order to be absolutely certain that you're publishing what you meant to publish. But that means really becoming an expert. You can't half-ass it. You have to truly become an expert, an amateur expert, we'll say. So that's a whole other thing, but that does connect though, because when you're writing a novel, you're becoming an amateur expert, no matter what. Every novelist I have ever met or ever read who successfully published a novel of their own, they became what I would call an amateur expert, not even by the end of the novel, but I would say at least by midway through. At the very least, if not at the beginning. To begin and to go on with and to indeed finish a novel is a momentous task, and in fact a great reason to celebrate once it's done. Try not to celebrate too much. That's a pitfall before you actually publish the book, because that's something I've found, in fact, often ends up delaying the procedure for longer than it needs to take. If not by forever, then at least by months or years. That is to say that celebrating too early can often lead to a kind of strange lethargy. You feel you kind of have your the laurels on before you're meant to have them on. So this is sort of what I wanted to talk about then, I guess, that how is it that you write that novel in the first place? Well, first of all, you have to figure out what you want the novel to be about. You have to decide what, first of all, is true to myself and possibly to my own story, even if it's not directly about me. There's a little bit of every author in their own work. To ask what story do I want to tell? And then secondarily, but not less important, what kind of story is going to be interesting to the audience that I'm targeting? Now, we'll assume that in this case, it's not a specific audience or demographic that you're targeting, but just a general reading audience, that you want to produce a novel that can be read by many different demographics. General interest novel. Well, first of all, you want to have something that is going to be somewhat unusual. I wouldn't, well, maybe not unusual, but I guess a better word is unique. But at the same time, it still needs to fall within the bounds of certain expectations. You don't want it to be so outlandish necessarily that it becomes a sci-fi novel, unless that's what you're shooting for. But nor do you want it to be so incredibly tedious that it becomes like some kind of postmodern Waiting for Godot, which not to smash Godot, but it's something that doesn't take place in a single room with uniform gray walls and a single chair and two actors talking about a rotting apple on the otherwise undecorated table between them, and that's basically the whole book, about their existential crisis over a rotting apple on an undecorated desk in a gray-walled, uniform gray room. It could be interesting, you never know. But it's an exercise in existentiality at the bounds of possible interest. There may be a certain sub-demographic for whom that would be like porn, but I think for a general audience, it probably would not be particularly turning on. So we're looking for something that is more interesting to a wider audience, has a bit of diversity within the plot and within the storytelling and the framework, and something that is going to have an appeal that perhaps is even lasting. So I guess in a way what I'm talking about is a type of classic novel. It doesn't have to be a novel in the sense of Ulysses, written by James Joyce, or something even along the lines of epic poems by Homer, or supposedly by Homer, or supposedly by the supposed Homer is probably the best way to put it. So yeah, it's actually a very interesting thing to think about, because I don't think it's necessarily very clear to anybody, even to an established novelist. You can take a master class essentially looking for to know the greatest tips that you possibly can know from people who are established authors who have, say, penned 20 or more novels, and maybe not that many, but ones that are best-selling. But truly, what I've found in my experience is that very frequently, even the best and most accomplished of authors are not particularly self-aware of how they ended up achieving the achievements they did. It takes someone who can really sort of deconstruct bit by bit the aspects of this process, or procedure, if you will, to really give you a sense of what needs to be done. So this is something that we'll be talking about in future videos, I should suspect. But as I said now, what I basically want to focus on, for the moment at least, is how to deal with that initial surge. How do you start that book? Well, the first step is to stop talking about it. Truly. I know that's hard. You're going to have to zip those lips. It's hard, I know. That's why I'm sighing. It's truly not easy. I'm telling that even to myself or my younger self. If you want to start that novel, stop talking about it, because you're wasting energy in talking about it and not actually doing it. So all that time that you may have talked to friends or family, or even to yourself, about that novel that you're planning to write, put that same oral energy, that same sort of chatterbox energy into the book. So if you're telling your friends or yourself or your family or whoever it may be about this great novel that you're planning on writing someday, and maybe you've mentioned that you have a character who's blind and one who's deaf and one who sees relatively well, and they're all friends. And that's already an interesting sort of start to this. Okay, so they grew up in the same village in Canada, we'll say. And okay, it's getting more interesting. Their fathers are all fishermen. Okay, interesting. And it kind of goes on there, from there starts developing, and in various directions. Maybe the three friends sort of split up and end up going to different destinations around the world, and we sort of get a sense of how their lives develop, both independently but also dependent in certain ways on how they were raised together in that one Canadian village. So that's on the face of it, maybe not the most interesting plot ever, but it has a lot of potential. And so consider something like that. Let's say you've talked about that plot to friends, family, to yourself, but you haven't really started. So with the novel itself. So go to that piece of paper and treat it as if it's your most trusted friend, and just start talking to the paper by writing with pen and ink, or I suppose for most people these days, on typewriter. No, I'm joking. On a computer screen with keys. And at first it's fine if you just want to just explode. Just allow yourself to literally just explode the words onto the paper. It doesn't matter how organized it is or how conveniently cohesive it is. Just say what you feel you have to say, as if you were trying to, in the greatest of passions, explain to your lover, to anybody who was so close to you that you couldn't possibly keep a secret from them. Say that to the waiting page. The waiting page, that's what I call it. And that's how a novel starts. Truly. I mean, I know there are people who have a different method, and they have the blank page staring before them, and they start sort of word by word and changing a little bit as they go along and tweaking this and tweaking that, and this is all in the first line of the entire book. But that's the difference. You have people who write books according to the method of the blank page, and then you have people who write books based on the methodology of the waiting page. So there's a big difference between those who write books by the blank page and those people who write books according to the way of the waiting page. Now, of course, as you might imagine, I go by the latter methodology, and it is by far the supremer, or the more supreme, right? So that's what I want primarily to pass along to you today, along with that one axiom that I mentioned before. So number one, write according to this standard. The only way to start is to start. And number two, don't write according to the way of the blank page. Write according to the way of the waiting page, because it's there almost as a kind of friend, as a friendly ear to hear your complaints and your kvetching. And that is a great way to start a novel. Obviously, that's not the only step, because you're going to have to edit that down and pare it down. You're going to have to whittle it down like a Kentuckian fellow outside of his smoke cabin whittling a soldier from wood. Now, obviously, that's not all of Kentucky. Don't take me the wrong way. I've had many great friends in Kentucky. Unfortunately, we had a falling out. But we used to record music back in the day in Lexington and Frankfurt and in between, and other states in West Virginia and Virginia. Well, anyway, that's the trip down memory lane. I could talk about that some other time, about my early recording career in Kentucky and West Virginia. But that's a whole other crazy story. Perhaps we'll write a novel about that. So back on track here. That's how we want to work in going forth with our very first novel, or even our very last novel. You never know even if your very first will be your very last, and you never know which one will be your very last. So write each novel, of course, as if it will be your last. Thanks for tuning in, and I will be able to, in future videos, in a more full way, explain all of the deeper subjects that we've touched on today. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I just want you to know I love you all and really appreciate your viewership. Give me a like and a subscription, and we'll talk again soon. This is Ben Kenny, or Ben Kenny, signing out.